All right, folks, in this video, we're going to talk about the 10 best legendary cards to craft, which means you shouldn't do this. That is a Golden Harbinger Celestia, and I'm going to lock it in. I did that for you guys, so you better watch this video.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Yeah, that stings, but you know, I wanted to open the video with something a little fun, so sure enough, we're going to figure out some way to use that Golden Harbinger Celestia if it's the last thing I do. Now, clearly, Celestia is not a card you want to be crafting, but I do have some recommendations for cards that you might want to add to your collection in this, the Rise of Shadows meta. Now, keep in mind, I'm going to be recommending cards here that are not just good right now, but potentially good for a while to come. So I'm going to be weighting things like neutral cards and classic set cards a little more heavily than cards that might be at the very tippity top of the meta right now. This is really more of a long-term crafting guide than a short one. That said, to throw everybody a bone, I did still want to talk about Rise of Shadows cards specifically and rank those on their craftability as far as I'm concerned. So real quick, let's jump into Rise of Shadows specifically before moving into the real list at large. So these are the rankings for my top 10 Rise of Shadows specific cards, none of which are actually going to make it onto the final top 10 list for the very best cards to craft in the game right now. These are all cards that are being played in some facet in the meta. I have biases a little bit towards neutral cards as well, because in general, neutral cards give you a little more bang for your buck than class cards, because you can, of course, use them across multiple classes and then, therefore, multiple decks typically. But you'll see here, like, Archivist Elysiana still taking the #1 spot because she's very prominent in Control Warrior, which is a deck that's actually seeing a little bit of a resurgence right now on the ranked ladder despite her nerfed 9 mana cost. And she's also just one of those cards that's like the ultimate value bomb sort of card, and that's the kind of thing that tends to be really good. Then you'll see something like Khadgar here, which is just fueling all mage decks right now. Conjurer's Calling is such a strong card, and Khadgar's connection to it makes him a really safe craft because mage right now is a deck with a couple different successful ways to play. Then you'll just see other successful class cards and things like Chef Nomi, for instance, that just help define decks. So each of these are playable cards at the moment. I suspect they'll be decent for a while. Things like Blastmaster Boom are a little bit riskier, perhaps even something like Heistbear and Togwaggle a little riskier, because they are dependent on specific sorts of things, lackeys and bombs, which might not always be relevant in the meta, but nonetheless, they're good right now. So if you're looking for decks today, these are cards that can't go wrong, and in many cases, they'll still be good crafts in the future, but not the very best cards to craft, which we're going to talk about right now. So let's jump in at the #10 spot here with Edwin Vancleef, of course, a staple class legendary for Rogue. Famously has been a part of every World Championship lineup in history in Hearthstone, so you can see from day one he's been good at the very top of the meta. Still remains relevant today, although not as good as he was pre-nerf to things like Prep and Raiding Party, still in a surprising number of decks. And the great thing about Edwin Vancleef, for someone who's looking to add powerful cards to your collection, he's the kind of thing that can just win you games on his own, which if you're somebody who's new or a beginner, those high impact cards can be really valuable for you. They can help power your wins because you can just play a 10-10 Edwin sometimes and win free games. That's a really good feeling when you're building out a collection. So Edwin, not only a card that's been around for a long time, seems like it's going to be sticking around for a while to come, but also just a card that feels really good and helps you win games quickly, which is great when you're crafting some key pieces for your collection. Moving on to the #9 spot here, I'm going to spotlight the hero cards. I'll just spoil it now, the next 3 spots, starting off with Hagath of the Witch. And the reason for that is hero cards right now are standing out as a very unique element in Hearthstone, given that there are only 3 of them, and they're some of the most downright powerful cards in the game. They just offer so much value or tempo. They're far more influential than the average card. So again, when you're building out a collection, adding a absolutely centerpiece style card like a hero card can go a really long way towards fueling your decks. Hagath, of course, for Shaman, great tool in control decks to generate lots of extra cards and spells. Also being played in things like Murloc Shaman right now, which is a really successful deck, shifting from that early game focus into more of a mid to late game focus as long as you have minions. So she's not only good right now, but as long as she's in standard format for the next 9 months or whatever it is, Hagath is going to be a card that makes sense for Shaman. If it's a class you like to play, you can't go wrong with this one. At the #8 spot here, we have Zul'jin for Hunter. And whereas Hagath is more of that grindy, long game style of card, this one's all about immediate impact and influence. And when you play Zul'jin, it often just wins you games. You just overwhelm your opponent with stuff on board, resources, value, whatever it is. Zul'jin can plop down a lot of things, and that's often a game-winning sort of turn. And it's not hard to build decks for Zul'jin either. There's a lot of good, cheap, easy spells for Hunter. A lot of decks just can toss in a Zul'jin and it's going to make sense at some level, whether it's secrets or just animal companions or unleash the beast. There's so many good supporting packages for Zul'jin that he's a rather flexible card, despite the fact that he's a 10 mana hero card that is spell focused. You can still just play him in a variety of things. So essentially you've got here a card that's hyper flexible and incredibly powerful. That's a perfect combination. And then at our number 7 spot, it's a little bit poetic here. We have the 7 mana, 7 armored Dr. Boom, Mad Genius. I think everybody knows just how powerful this card is. It's been fueling Warrior for a long time. It's the best hero card in standard format right now. It just does everything. Giving your mechs rush is absurd. All kinds of crazy value off things like Delivery Drone. This is just one of the best cards in the game. And the only reason it's not higher on this list is that it's a class card, so you only have Warrior options to play this. Beyond that, it is eventually going to rotate out, right? It's a Boomsday Project card. So it's only got about 9 months left. So I did show a little more deference to neutral cards and classic set cards in particular. But if you're looking for a card that's going to help drive a deck or add like the best possible thing to your collection, Dr. Boom Mad Genius has to be among your top choices. Moving on to the number 6 spot here, all future cards are going to be neutral cards. And again, I do that because I think they're the most important ways to build a fundamentally sound Hearthstone collection. Not all of these cards are going to be better right now, but when you're crafting things, you're not thinking about just today, you're thinking about 6 months from now, a year from now, maybe even 5 years from now. Because Malygos is a classic card and a neutral card that has been played in a lot of different decks throughout the years, I suspect that will remain true in the future. He's not particularly popular at this moment in the meta, but he'll come back and he'll power something in the future. That's just what Malygos does. So that's why he's the bottom of these neutral cards on this list, but nonetheless, still, I think a card that fundamentally will add something to your collection. Now, if you, for some reason, do care more about today, then yeah, maybe Dr. Boom or Zul'jin will go a little further. But if you're wanting to build a good, future-proof Hearthstone collection, Malygos and this incredible spell damage sets up so many combo opportunities and can power and really be the centerpiece for so many different decks that this is a great card to have. Moving into the top 5 here, we have Blood Mage Thalnos. I know this is a card that not a lot of people get excited about because it's just like a 2-mana 1/1, and you might think, well, goodness gracious, Regis, 2-mana 1/1's not going to change how I play Hearthstone. This isn't good enough. But this is one of those cards that's just incredibly flexible. You can put it in just about anything and feel good about it because it does a little bit of everything, right? It's a cheap minion. It draws a card. It's got spell damage. It works in so many different worlds. And usually it's played for the spell damage aspects, but sometimes that Death Rattle card draw goes a long way too. It's even being played a bit today in Tempo Rogue, and I think I've seen some Holy Wrath OTK Paladin lists running this in a handful of different decks. So even though I don't really identify it with one particular deck today, it's still in 5% of Hearthstone decks, which is really pretty high in the scheme of things. So it just always pops up. It's that card you're like, oh yeah, sure, Blood Mage Thalnos, that makes sense. And that's why it's such a good card to have in your collection, because you just always feel like there's a home for it. Moving on to the number 4 spot here, we have Alexstrasza. I think this is my first Legendary in Hearthstone and still remains one of my favorite because she was good like 5 years ago when I started playing, and she's still really, really good today. Being played most prominently right now in these Freeze Mage style decks that are running Luna's Pocket Galaxy to reduce the cost of things like Alexstrasza to 1 mana, which is pretty crazy. But the battle cry here is what makes Alexstrasza so good, right? It does something like 15 damage, sets up all kinds of crazy burn and combo opportunities where you just burst your opponent down with either minions on board or setting up some kind of combo in hand. It's also just sometimes a good value minion where you can play a big 8/8 and do a little chip damage, or play a big 8/8 and heal yourself for like 14 health. So she's always found a way to be played, whether it's aggressively, defensively, in a dragon synergy deck. There's just a lot of different ways to slice this card, and that's why she's really one of the best things you can add to your collection, both today, but for the next 20 years too. Moving into the top 3 here, we have our buddy Harrison Jones as really the ultimate tech card in Hearthstone. This is a great way to answer opponents' weapons by drawing some cards in the process. So not only do you remove their asset, but you gain a lot of advantage yourself in doing so. Also a reasonably sized body on this minion as well. So he's just like the perfect tech card. He does everything you would want in a tech card, and he does it exceptionally well. And that's why across a lot of different metas, whether they're heavily weapon driven or not, Harrison Jones has still popped into control lists here and there because just having that answer to weapons is nice. And with things like Gluttonous Ooze gone, Harrison really does feel like the best weapon tech in my mind. Acidic Swamp Ooze, although cheap, doesn't have quite the upside of something like Harrison Jones. And we are seeing this played quite a bit in Hearthstone today, even though weapons have gone away a little bit. There are still some really powerful weapons out there. And particularly in combination with things like Weapons Project for Warrior, you can guarantee some pretty fantastic card draw when you play this fellow. Now, you might be wondering why I put this above a card like Alexstrasza, which is like really big and deck defining. And I think it just comes down to flexibility. Harrison's one of those cards you can toss into any deck. Alexstrasza doesn't necessarily work that way. Sometimes the deck has to be built with Alexstrasza in mind or built to support Alexstrasza, which can limit her use cases in some ways. But Harrison, you can toss into just about anything and it'll work. So he's getting, although a slight power level disadvantage to Alexstrasza, a big flexibility boost, and that's why he made it into the top 3. So now up at our number 2 spot, we have Zilly Axe, which for this card, all you have to do is look at the data. He is being played currently in over 65% of Hearthstone decks. 65% of Hearthstone decks. If you play a game in Hearthstone, there's a 2/3 chance your opponent is going to have Zilly Axe in their deck, which for me is the highest I've ever seen that number. Corridor Creeper got to like 48% to my memory. Dr. Boom was like 45%. I don't remember a card ever getting anywhere close to Zilly Axe for an inclusion rate. Pretty much every deck out there can run Zilly Axe successfully. Clearly, there are some mech decks to do it very well, but there are others who just toss it in as a great little heal flexibility card. And if you look at the card, you can see why. It does literally everything. Like every keyword imaginable is on this card. Not literally, but most of them, right? And that's why he's just so good across a variety of things. Control decks can run him. Aggro decks can actually run him too, just as a way to help stabilize in the mid game or take some value trades. Mech decks certainly love him. He's just the jack of all trades, absolutely. And the only reason Zilly Axe is not the number 1 spot on this list, and I think there's still a pretty good argument for it, is that eventually Zilly Axe will rotate out of standard format. So it's not a card you get to keep forever. You only have about 9 months right now to use this card, which, I mean, certainly a long time. I recommend crafting him. He's my number 2 choice, but he's not quite as good as my number 1. And that spot belongs to Leroy Jenkins. He has topped this video series quite a few times as the best card to craft in Hearthstone. And the fact that he keeps taking the number 1 spot is probably a sign that he deserves it, because Leroy is a card that always features prominently in Hearthstone as the finisher. He's the go-to neutral burst option, and a lot of different decks that want to play fast, want to play aggressively, make room for this card. And although I guess maybe right now today he's probably not being played as much as we've seen in the past, he still has absurd inclusion rate numbers, still feels like one of the most powerful cards in the game. And he's, you know, unless that changes or the way Hearthstone is played drastically differs in the future, I think he's going to remain one of the most played cards in the game forever, because we just don't have any other neutral burst option like this. Some classes just have to have this, and this is an extra way to get tons of damage through. So Leroy is our champion at the number 1 spot here. In my mind, still the very best legendary card to craft in Hearthstone. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this list. Now, I know there's always a lot of personal opinion that goes into this one. There's nothing objective about this, so I'm sure some of you will disagree. And you know what? I would encourage you to. Please don't just take my word as gospel. Go read other people's opinions. Listen to what people have to say in the comments. Take a wide array of data, gather it all together, and then make an informed decision based on what you've heard and the different arguments people present. But I hope this gave you at least a little bit of guidance, a little bit of direction if you were curious, a little bit of a tier list here for what to craft next. That said, I want to thank you very much for watching, and until next time, game on.